Once again, welcome everyone to session 4 of People of the Book. Today, I probably say this every week, but today is one of my favorite kind of topics to talk about because I love the text. I love the whole of the Sermon on the Mount, but the specific texts we get to talk about today are always so fun to talk about because it's so enlightening in a lot of ways. Sometimes with passages like this and so many others, we get raised and we're taught a certain way to understand them, right? And then a lot of times that gets changed as we go through Bible studies like this. So when we consider the Sermon on the Mount, it is one of those passages that often gets stripped down to what we're going to focus on today, which is like, people, when they remember a few things, and the key things that most people remember are turn the other cheek, eye for an eye. If someone wants your coat, give them your cloak as well. Go the extra mile. We sort of encapsulate it with what we're looking at today. And unfortunately, so these are primary wonderful texts, but unfortunately, they're often utilized, most often by people who do not understand Judaism, but they're utilized as a way to say, see, look at how Judaism was so legalistic and Christianity is so merciful. That's the way these texts are often utilized, okay? And the truth is, you've heard that famous quote from Mohandas Gandhi, an eye for an eye makes everyone blind, everybody blind. That's the way we treat these texts, or we look at that particular text, okay? And so there's this underlying current of division between the two, kind of connected to these particular passages. People also have used these passages to say, see, Jesus would be against gun ownership and even self-defense. Just turn the other cheek and take it. And that is also a misguided appropriation of these texts. We're going to look at that. Because Jesus was no different than any rabbi in his day or previous to him or after him. And that is, rabbis and all people within Judaism are all about interpreting the Torah. They take it and they try to make it more useful for their time. So what Matthew even says that we must keep in mind is that Jesus doesn't come to abolish the Torah. He's coming to fulfill it, as Matthew's language uses or says, which is it's a way to say, I'm coming to show you how it might be more applicable to our lives today, okay? And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how he does that and why it's the case. And we're going to spend a little time kind of understanding, how that happened within Judaism. But I admit that a class like today's has so much material that we could go down lots of rabbit holes. That's why I wanted to focus on just a few that I think provide excellent examples of how this all works, okay? So we're going to look at those passages in particular, the eye for an eye, the turn the other cheek stuff, and appreciate a little bit more of the context, and hopefully by the end come to a whole new appreciation of both our sense of the legalistic Judaism and then sort of what these texts mean within Christianity and within Matthew. Okay, so any comments, questions, or even thoughts from previous weeks that have stayed with you? That you'd like to raise now before we get into any readings. Yes, Marilyn.
And I'm so glad you started with this because as I've read these two versions, I thought, oh, that's where a lot of anti-Semitism comes from.
Yes.
And so I'm glad we're going to really
we're going to be reading these texts that I have for us, and we're going to be seeing how, when you read them on face value, it comes across a very particular way, which, as Marilyn pointed out, you can see where it has led to a sense of either anti-Semitism or Christian sort of supersessionism, this idea that Christianity is better. It's an improvement on Judaism. And these things, this is how it plays out because of texts that we'll be reading today. But again, our hope is to understand what underlies these. And as we get that understanding, it'll change some of our perspective. And I think render some of those old approaches invalid. really, because they're missing the point is what a lot of it comes down to. But thank you. It's a great question and a great comment. Yes, Marcia.
Are they missing the point because they're not taking it from Greek enough?
It's not so much the language thing. It's more about getting into the idea of how these codes were utilized. Yeah, what function they actually served within society. And so we'll get into that, but it's not so much an interpretation thing today in terms of the language stuff that we've been seeing from other classes. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay. We passed around in the class here some of the printouts of the text. I'm going to open it up on screen so that we can kind of read through it. You know, these are a little bit more like narratives, but I think it's really worth looking at it. So we're going to read through the Matthew passage and then the Exodus passage down here. So I think for this first one, let's try using the folks in the room to read a paragraph each, and then I'll ask the folks online to read the Exodus passage. So could we have a volunteer for the first portion of the Matthew reading? Carol, thank you.
Matthew 5:17 through 48, New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. The law and the prophets. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Thank you. Let's keep going. And make sure to project if possible, as best you can.
I'm going to read online.
Okay.
You know that our ancestors were told, do not murder, and a murderer must be brought to trial. But I promise you that if you are angry with someone, you will have to stand trial. If you call someone a fool, you will be taken to court. And if you say that someone is worthless, you will be in danger of the fires of hell. So if you are about to place your gift on the altar and remember someone is angry with you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. Make peace with that person, then come back and offer your gift to God. Before you are dragged into court, make friends with the person who has accused you of doing wrong. If you don't, you will be handed over to the judge and then to the officer who will put you in jail. I promise you that you will not get out until you have paid the last cent you owe.
Thank you. Let's keep going. More fun topics. The adultery one.
Yeah, I think I missed.
Okay.
You have heard that, and I'm going to read my Bible.
Okay.
You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully,
I can't get it any louder.
with her in his heart,
Ooh,
eye causes sin, gouge it out, throw it away.
right as loud as I can, I think.
We need louder.
It
They
is
can't
better
hear
for
you.
to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell.
All right, thank you. The next person can read the divorce and the oaths one. Okay.
Concerning divorce, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Concerning oaths, again you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black.
Shut the door.
Word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one.
Thank you.
Concerning retaliation. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I not an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces
This
you,
must be the Sermon on the Mount.
give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you.
Thank you.
Love for enemies. Go ahead.
Yeah, just as loud as possible.
You have heard that it was said, you shall love and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay. That's the sermon. That's a portion of the Sermon on the Mount. Could I get volunteers from online to read the text that's on the computer here and just kind of go through, I don't know, 5 verses each if you can, and see how that goes. But let's just read through the Exodus 21 passage. I can't see all of you, so just go ahead and start reading, if you don't mind. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Exodus 21, 12, 27. Whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. If it was not premeditated, but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. But if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution. Whoever strikes father and mother shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person has been sold or is still held in possession, shall be put to death.
Thank you for that. That was really wonderful. Who wants to keep going with all these lovely code? That was 17.
On Valentine's Day.
On Valentine's.
Valentine's. Hey, you know what? Blood is red. Verse 17, if someone would.
Whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. When individuals quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or fist, so the injured party, though not dead, is confined to bed, but recovers and walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability, except to pay for the loss of time and to arrange for full recovery. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. When the people who are fighting and injure a pregnant woman so that there is miscarriage and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge determines. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the two.
That last, kind of wonder if there are a lot of slaves knocking out their own teeth. Yeah. Thank you all for the reading. I really appreciate that. I know it's hard to hear in some aspects, but it's really, I think it's good to get a little bit of a fuller context, even though we're not going to be focusing on much of what we just read. I hope that you are hearing some sort of pattern here that was fairly constant. I'm going to stop sharing the text so I can see more of you online. But just know that in general, the pattern that we see there is, you've heard it said, but I say. And to say that is not, you've heard it said, so throw that out. I'm telling you what's what. No, it's saying, you've heard it said this, but I'm taking it to another level. Okay, I'm asking you to be to do the tougher path. So Jesus is still utilizing it, but interpreting it, but taking it to another level. Okay, that's the sort of Matthew passage. And then the Exodus one, that's one of the law codes. And one of my first questions is, what does it mean when we say that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, are the law of Israel? What do you think it means when we say that? Okay, so Barbara here says it's the rules they go by. But even that is still a little vague. What do you mean when you say the rules they go by? What kind of rules? How are the rules utilized?
The legal rules,
Like in their everyday life.
the legal rules.
So, okay, so Horty's offering the legal rules, like actual legal codes and rules.
That's what they practice.
Okay, so these are the things that they practice.
Norms.
Okay, norms is different. Legal codes are certainly different than norms. But, okay, this is good. This
And
is good.
also consequences, it gives you the
Okay, so
consequences.
you think it's more connected to that legal code thing, consequences. Okay, anyone else have any suggestions as to what it is that the Torah, calling it the law, means?
The framework for their sort of like code of ethics and
Okay.
you
A
know,
framework for a code of ethics. Okay, that's a little different than legal codes for sure. Dick?
Well, mine was more of a question. I was so surprised to see so much specifics. And it makes me wonder if they really did this, if this was really followed.
That's a great question, and that's really what I'm getting at. That's what I'm getting at here. I have another hand up here, Bev.
So, it's about entering the kingdom of heaven.
Well, for Matthew, that's part of his context, but the Sermon on the Mount is kind of characterized by that phrasing, and it kind of is an encouragement for the people that's one of the motivations that he's offering, that Matthew's offering, and say, why would they do this? Because it will bring you to a whole new state of being. Okay, kingdom of heaven does not just mean after this life; it means a whole presence now, an experience of God now and into the future, but it starts now. So it's a lot of what you're saying is, I mean, the whole way that the Sermon on the Mount is presented by Matthew, it's Jesus going up to the mountain to reinterpret the law. Who does that remind you of?
Moses.
It's Moses. Yes, and Matthew has utilized this the whole time. Jesus is the new Moses reinterpreting the law. Okay. I think I saw Honeybee.
I'm just, relationship keeps popping in my mind. It's like how people need to deal with each other somehow.
Yeah, there's definitely a relational character to this, and relationships, that can be managed by legal codes or norms or kind of just different guidelines. What if I said to you this, that the word Torah, which we often interpret as law, is just as viably interpreted as instruction? How would that change your sense of what the law is? How does the word instruction, even in connotation, how does that differ from the word law?
Teaches.
It's a teach.
do as opposed to what you must.
Okay, so it brings us back to, I think, Dick's word of guidelines. Instruction is more flexible. It's a suggestion based on wisdom and experience, oftentimes. Okay,
Consequences.
and sorry?
There's no consequences.
Yet there are consequences. It just might not be imposed juridical consequences, but there could be consequences that are natural outcomings. Kind of just like when you watch your child put a little, step stool on the counter so they can reach the high snacks that you hid, and just kind of watching, I'm not going to cause the consequences. This is a fake example, by the way. I didn't just sit here. When the child stands up on something like that and then falls, that's a consequence of that action. That's not a code. It's just, so there are consequences that are spoken to in these, when you do this, it tends to have this result, that kind of thing. But not necessarily legal consequences. Well, it depends, doesn't it? It depends on how these laws are utilized. Anyone else have any kind of comments about that? Whether just what the word instruction brings up versus law to you?
There aren't the severe punishment. I mean, that there would be if this was, you do this, and so therefore this is the judgment and this leads to the punishment.
Yes, I mean, and here's the thing. It's within ancient Israel, there were judges, they utilized the law, these law codes. It wasn't intended to be these specific ways. At least there's no evidence, very little evidence, that within ancient Israel, they ever used these laws in the ways that they're presented. Okay, even the Decalogue, even the 10 Commandments, we have no evidence as to how they might have enforced that. There's certainly solid codes of ethics, the 10 Commandments. They basically, what we could all agree on, kind of ensure a manageable, even society, a sustainable society. But in terms of how that ever played out, we don't know based on those, how those were ever sort of administered or enforced. There's a concept you may have heard of within, I think it's Exodus, but have you ever heard of the Jubilee?
Yeah.
Jubilee is a process of kind of balancing. Okay, every 7 years, you let the land lay fallow so that it can recover, and you just live off what it produces. But then every 50 years, you do that, as well as return debts, return people to their ancestral lands. It's kind of this way of rebalancing society so that the rich don't just keep getting richer and the poor just keep getting poorer. But there's no evidence that it actually ever happened. So what it suggests is a lot of the codes that we see, these law codes, are aspirational rather than actual sort of legal codes like modern codes we think of, where this is the law and we are going to do this and enforce it in this way. There's little evidence that a lot of these laws were utilized that way. Okay, so it opens up our whole appreciation of the Torah when we see and we understand that the whole approach to being a Jew is to take texts like the law and work with them, decide how they fit in a context. And even the laws we see. So in Exodus, you get all these covenantal laws. This is sort of, scholars have identified different periods and authors and types of laws within Israel that are all very much context. It all depends on when they were written and for whom and what was going on. And sometimes when you compare laws, they contradict each other. But it's because they're reflective of a specific time. So you've got the Exodus laws that are called the covenantal laws. Then within Deuteronomy, there's all these other codes they call the Deuteronomistic laws. I can't even say that myself, so I don't expect any of you to. And then within Leviticus, there's the holiness code. There's all sorts of laws that kind of get wrapped up into the larger Torah, but they're all very much reflective of different times. Maybe the purity laws, for example, were, they believe, developed during the time of exile, when it became much more important for Jews to remember how they were different. And since they had to maintain a sense of their identity in a foreign land, purity laws help us do that. Food laws help us do that. Okay, that helps keep us, give us identity when we don't have a land. Remember, we've already talked about this. Why is the Sabbath so important? Because it allows connection to God when we don't have a land. It's not about geography, it's about time. Okay, so these laws develop over years depending on what's happening within Israel. Okay, Bertie?
When they say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that in a way that's really being merciful, because if somebody knocks out your tooth, you don't kill them.
That, in fact, is the next you're just following, like, it's a beautiful comment. That it's this whole idea, you know, we read the Exodus passage and that sounds really harsh, and it is harsh. But when we approach it from a perspective of legal principle, rather than actual juridical law, and we're going to operate according to these standards, it becomes then something that can be seen as merciful, just like Bertie pointed out. And I kind of mentioned this in a sermon not too long ago too, but the whole idea of an eye for an eye, what Bertie just said, it's intended to ensure that any punishment fits the crime. Someone knocks out your tooth, you don't cut their head off. Okay, it's not that they're actually going to go say, well, you knocked out their tooth, get over here, let me tie them, let's tie the string, you're going to lose one. No, but it's an effort to describe in very, very clear terms the kind of society we want to be. It's aspirational. Okay, it's a way to say, this is who we are. This is a way of protecting those who are vulnerable, of ensuring that we don't just kind of keep escalating harm, because we know how that can happen. So there is a way to look at these eye for an eye type codes as being intended to be more about fairness and even mercy as much as justice. Okay, any other comments about that? Sandy and then Bonnie?
Well, when you said it's instruction, I think of teachers using examples, and maybe not the real thing, but use that as an example for what they want to get across. So yeah. I think of teachers rather than judges, I guess.
Yes, and it's such a that's a wonderful comment, because then think of Jesus himself. He's not sitting there when he's with the masses teaching them law codes. He's telling them stories, because it's about instruction. It's about how, you know, these laws are there because they describe something that we long for in our society. But how do we connect the dots? We tell stories, and we help people's real life situations connect to those laws. That's what I try to do every Sunday with a sermon. You know, it's kind of like we read a passage and it's like, whoa, what's this one about? Or, oh yeah, I know what that one's about. And then hopefully a sermon using story and personal experience, it opens it up for us. And it connects us more deeply to the scripture, which is not just about telling us what to do exactly in a black and white way. No, it's soil in which we plant our hands and our fingers and we dig in there and we see what grows. Okay, that's part of what Jesus is doing. That's what the law is, that material. The law is like that soil in which people are invited to dig into. Okay, but we often think of law in our modern context as something that is just sort of unassailable. It is what it is, that kind of thing. Now, if Becca was here, if there are any lawyers in the audience, they might disagree with me, because lawyers know and judges know that there is often latitude within law. But nonetheless, in a general sense, our attitude about law is much more of a black and white construct than it is, say, instruction, than the flexibility of instruction. Bonnie, you had your hand up.
I had a whole problem with the slave part. I could see how people back in the day who were slaveholders could have said, well, see, the Bible says, you know, it's all right to have slaves, and, you know, if they live a couple days before they die after you beat them, well, then there's no punishment for that. I mean, if you looked at that literally, from my perspective, that makes no sense. And it's also very immoral to have slaves to begin with. So I just had a whole problem with that.
No, and that's good. And I invite you all, okay, it's good that you had a problem with that. It's good that you sort of conceived this idea that, if we took that literally, that's horrible. I admit a lot of the lines in that Exodus text probably made people feel like that. Hold on to that. We'll get to it later. We're not going to talk about each example though. Okay. But what I've suggested already, I think is like a little bit of a crack. It's a little bit of an entry point. If we think of these as legal principles and not specific moral or legal juridical laws with which we govern our society on a day-to-day basis, then it at least opens up something else being stated here. And we'll get to, some of that a little bit. But again, we're trying to focus on a few of these passages. Marilyn?
I find it very helpful what you said about stories. That stories were being used to develop these rather than sort of legal principles. Because it brings it helps me to sort of understand their society.
Yeah.
Rather than the specifics of the different murder and slaves and all that.
Right.
And one of the things that really struck me was how so many of these within the stories, it's the man in the situation. Women aren't even necessarily mentioned, but if they are, it's the man who makes the decision, such and such happens, and it depends on what her husband thinks the punishment should be.
Okay,
But
Dick.
in his own way, when Jesus is making those comments, and again, we're not really going to be talking about the divorce one, but in that society, women were treated as property, and when men could treat them and throw them out that way, Jesus is actually stating something that you could say is sort of early feminism, where he's trying to protect a woman who would then be left out and have very little in order a way of fending for herself. He's trying to set a much more strict understanding of when divorce is permissible. In fact, he only lists one case, that it's permissible. So the idea is it's not just about making, let's set a standard by which we can all be better men. He's trying to create a more just society in the midst of a society that has certain laws and sees men as full agents and women as property. So and the Gospels all do that. They all sort of play on that, and they're trying to encourage that broader understanding of our humanity and our shared agency, our shared dignity. Okay, and these passages we're going to talk about are very good. Now, I want to reiterate something that I think I said in the first session. We think of, a lot of us were raised, to think of Israel as this legalistic, kind of religion. And some of the stories in the New Testament suggest that. Right? Think about Jesus' reaction to the Pharisees when he's like walking and he plucks the head of a wheat or something, and they're like, "Hey, you're working." And then one time he heals someone on the Sabbath, and they say, "You can't do that on the Sabbath." We have to remember this, that those stories are more caricature than anything. And the perspective of the Pharisees was that part of the reason that the exile happened in Babylon was because the people fell away from a deeper, more committed adherence to the law, to the instruction. So the Pharisees were sort of operating like any of us would. Your kid falls off that stool off the counter, you would do anything to help that not happen again. So the Pharisees' approach is they want to get more strict because they believe that it's only by that type of adherence that the people will actually avoid getting carted off again. It's that association. We need to follow these rules. We need to follow these guidelines better because we don't want to risk once again being carted off. So that is an important part of the perspective of the Pharisees. So as we read stories, not necessarily from today, but a lot of the gospel stories, they kind of communicate that. I think it's important to just hold that idea in your head, to give the Pharisees a little bit more latitude, a wide berth in your assessment of them. But let's then move into what it means to turn the other cheek. I have delighted in talking about this previously, and so I'm wondering if people have heard, if you remember, or if you have thoughts of your own, but I'd love to hear what people's understanding of turn the other cheek is. What does it mean to turn the other cheek?
It has to do with you using the other side of your hand.
Okay, okay. Can someone, Carol, would you please stand up so in front of the camera here and I want to demonstrate? Yeah, okay. And the way the passage is written is very specific. If someone slaps you on your right cheek, right? That's what it says. Now, we're going to start. This is a little demonstration. I feel like I've done this before. Now, what do you presume about people in ancient society? Most of them were right-handed. You still have words in Italian like sinister, French, gauche. All those mean are left or left-handed, or yeah, they just mean left, and they carry with them a semblance of evil. Okay, so it was from ancient days, we have associated left-handedness with a problem. So people were encouraged to be right-handed. So we assume right-handedness. Now, if I'm going to smack Carol, which I really don't, if it was Jim, maybe I would, but no, it's a backhanded slap. In order to hit her right cheek, it's a backhanded slap, which is the slap. Thank you. That's good. It's
Well, good.
the backhanded slap. It's the slap of a superior, of someone in that honor shame culture, a master to a slave or a soldier to a peasant. It's the slap of a superior, and it's a dismissive slap. It's a slap of humiliation. And so what do you do in that situation? Well, what does Jesus say when he says turn the other cheek? What's he trying to get at here? Why does turning the other cheek make such a difference? Let them
Then you're slapped as an equal.
Ah, did everyone hear that?
I was gonna say,
You know, when you get slapped in that society, you have a few options and none of them are good. You could hit back, right? You could hit back, and that would risk being either beaten or killed if you did that in that society because of the honor, the levels of, you know, structure, the strata in society. You could just take it and be humiliated, or there's a third way. And that's what Jesus says. And as Horty pointed out, to turn your other cheek is to offer them the left cheek. And that way, the way you either smack with an open hand, which is a much more forceful hit, or it invites a jab, a punch. And that's a much more violent hit. So what is the point? What is Jesus getting at by telling people to do just that? Dick?
Forgiveness.
Not really forgiveness. No, not forgiveness. At least not yet. What does it mean to offer that other cheek?
Sounds like bring it on.
A little bit. Not so much bring it on, like, yeah, beat me, I can take it. You're not like Rocky here, but it's something else. What else? Huh? Resistance. It is a way of nonviolent resistance. So it can lead to forgiveness, Dick. And it is sort of like, you know, bring it on. But by saying bring it on, it means I am not going to let you treat me like an inferior. And I'm going to stand here and allow you to show your violence by giving me the cheek that is the more forceful hit, because both of them are violent, but the first one is intended to shame you or humiliate you. To stand there and turn your other cheek is a way of resistance. It's a way of saying, I'm not going to let you treat me like an inferior. Because I have my own humanity. And yet the beauty of it is you're not doing anything violent. You're not changing the honor structure. You're just revealing the shame of the perpetrator in that sense, because you're basically, they're showing their violence. Okay. And that is, you know,
Dan,
and to shame them. Yeah.
It says to me in the context of what you're telling us today, almost as if you're given the slap of humiliation, open the dialogue to interpretation. Like you were talking about the interpretation of the Torah. Okay, here are your obligations. It may be bring it on. It may just be opening the dialogue.
Yeah, well, it's a way of just saying, I'm not going to let you decide who I am in this moment. I'm going to stand up. You know, these are what the ones that look, the Martin Luther Kings, Gandhi himself, these leaders that embrace this idea of nonviolent resistance utilize these types of passages to recognize, you know, and it makes sense. Think about, let's use Martin Luther King. He was not developing a lot of traction within white America until when? Until Bull Connor opened up those hoses on children. And we got to see that on television.
Mhm.
And it was devastating. And we saw the naked brutality of him because they just simply stood up and refused to be pushed aside. It's the same move. It's the same energy. It's resistance. It's a way of claiming dignity and then revealing the lack of dignity on the part of the perpetrator. It's brilliant, but it is not namby-pamby. Okay? It's not, see how bad those eye for an eye Jews are? I'm just going to turn the other cheek and I'm going to be the nicest person ever. That's not what it's about at all. That's a mischaracterization. And when we see it that way, you can see how it leads to such a false distinction between these two approaches. I see Bev and then Marcia.
About that Iranian girl that would wear her hijab.
Yes.
I think when she went to the police station, that's who she was with.
Yeah.
I mean, she just,
Yeah, we think about, and the risks of standing up, even with nonviolent resistance, are still that you will be punished by those in power and punished, sometimes killed. And that is the risk. Marcia was
sorry.
first, but then I can come to you, Carol.
So the lex talionis is the law of retaliation.
That's the Roman code on which, yeah, these would have been based. And within Rome, that was a legal standard.
So, but it's funny that the title, the head subheading of this, which you don't like, says law of non-resistance. So it's like they took there's a law of retaliation. Now this is the law of non-resistance.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet, resistance.
Right. Well, and that, again, when we see headings, whether it's the text that I printed for you that we read from online or that I passed out, or in your Bibles, none of those headings are present in the text. Those are all interpreters trying to help, so to speak, the reader understand the text better, but they're not always helpful, because I look at that comment is almost the opposite. And what that heading does, the law of non-resistance, it actually it galvanizes those false distinctions that I was pointing out, that Christianity is the more merciful and Judaism is the more restrictive and legalistic, and it's not necessarily the case. We've talked about how eye for an eye functioned as a means of aspirational fairness. Okay, so it's not necessarily just brutality. And this idea of turning the other cheek is not about being a nice masochist. It's about being someone that stands up without showing more force, without escalating force or harm, and stands up for dignity. And that's power. That's power in that, especially in that society. Good. Any other comments? I see Carol and then Ken.
Okay, in our society, the kneeling of the athlete in front of the flag was his nonviolent resistance to the way Blacks were being treated.
Yeah.
And that has been so misinterpreted as being, showing disrespect rather than.
It's true. And we see these examples all the time, right? And she's talking about Colin Kaepernick kneeling, and other athletes too. Kneeling, which is a sign of prayerful respect from many people,
right?
From most people in most situations, but then not all situations. And so that got interpreted by some as an offense to the flag and to the ideals of the country. And yet we also remember back in 1968, Tommy Smith, the black gloves, that was received in a very similar fashion, that it seemed as an affront to the flag. And yet it wasn't about the flag, so to speak. It was about the ideals of a country. And I do believe that with hindsight, we look back on that as a courageous act, because they were standing up for the country that they loved. And that's part of the challenge, is that sometimes we have a narrow vision of what it looks like to show your patriotism. Okay. And when our vision gets more and more narrowed, about how we show our patriotism, how we show our love of country, that's called nationalism.
Mhm.
That's called your way of showing it is not acceptable. I'm going to kind of keep narrowing it. And that's some of the challenges that we're facing now.
Mhm.
And those challenges have been faced across various civilizations and times. Okay. But what Jesus is doing here in his context is trying to provide something that's like grassroots, ground level, human-based ways of showing resistance that will not sort of wake up the bear of Rome so that you actually, die. Because if they were to throw a punch in retaliation, they would just be like, okay, see ya, you're gone. So you had to find ways to stand up for yourself that weren't going to poke the bear. So this is one of those ways. This is what these laws or these practices that Jesus is talking about accomplish. Did I miss someone? Was it Dick Furt? Oh no, Ken. I had missed Ken.
I was going to say something about the cities of refuge, because when I was thinking about that was an interesting and humane thing, and I thought, gee, it would be nice if we had something like that now. And then I was thinking about what's happened in our country in the last year or so regarding abortion, and for a lot of women now, they can go to another state.
Yeah.
As a city of refuge, if the laws are making their lives very difficult. And so it's just an interesting new way that biblical concept is being.
Yes,
Right,
and that's a great example. Ken brings up the recent sort of ways that abortion laws have restricted access to women's health care, and that's created opportunities for places where else they can go and receive the care that they need. This has happened throughout history, hasn't it? And the way these biblical codes, as Ken just pointed out, kind of reflect this idea of how do we move, how do we grapple, how do we adapt, how do we see this law within our context is always an important move. But yet we also know, maybe within ourselves or within circles of friends, that there are some people that look at the law as being not about that. We don't interpret like that. We need it to be this, this, and this. That's what law is, right? Well, it might be more of a conversation than that. And I think the biblical approach to law is helpful in terms of our way of being in society together. Because if it's just always about black and white, we see that just creates more and more division, and that makes it harder to be in a sustainable society, which is really why laws are there. Really, right? Laws are there to help society function better. I saw Marilyn and Dick.
I was reading the very next example. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Wondering how that fits.
Oh, we will
And
be
then-
talking about that. Yeah.
Okay, well, then I thought if you let him have your cloak also, you are someone who has sort of some standing in that, some control over it. It's something that you haven't been asked for. You're taking it one more step, and anyway, I can't.
I love it.
the words
Hey,
about-
the enthusiasm is great. And there is a connection between these examples. But before we get to that, I want to just make sure that we finished with this last.
One had more to do with the question, not so much.
Sure.
interpretation. Marcia mentioned Rome and Judaism and Torah and so on and so forth. I would think chronologically, Rome came into play in the New Testament after the Torah.
Right. Yeah. But that was the context within which the Matthew and the Gospels were written. So when Jesus was functioning, it was within that Roman context and their laws, because again, Judaism was within Rome at that point.
I just had a follow-up point. I'm reading the two mountains by David Brooks, and one of the things that he mentions in there was, and I think you touched on it, was kind of a guideline of like over 600 different items to try to, and it wasn't laws, it was more guidelines.
Instruction. Yeah, it was instructions.
Which I was just rethinking.
It is. And sometimes that can be shocking to us. And I say, good. Good, because we get a richer appreciation of how these laws function. And when we see them as guidelines, when we see them as instructions, it opens up just more possibility, more room to breathe, more room for mercy instead of just legalism, okay? But let's go ahead and move to this next example. This one, if someone wants to sue you for your coat, then give them your cloak as well. What does that mean? And what does it do? It's a similar move, okay, as the first one. It's kind of based in, it's in the same playing field, okay? But what does that accomplish? What does it mean to take off your cloak? Or, you know, what is a cloak? Okay, they sue you for your coat, okay? Your coat is like what Honey D's wearing, your parka, your outer layer. What's the cloak? Bonnie?
I'm not certain if this is a good example, but on the news the other night, there was a guy that had his store broken into. And what he did, I mean, the guy was caught that broke into the store. He offered that guy a job. He said, you have had a lot of, you know, bad breaks, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to give you a chance to do something good instead of going in and, you know, robbing people. Here is a job where you can earn a living. Now, I don't know if that's the same thing, but it was like he could have, you know, he could have done all kinds of things in retaliation, but instead he turned it around.
Well, I think in terms of the specific examples we're talking about, it's not the same thing, but in the overall conversation we've been having, to choose for mercy in that way over legalism, and to make the consequence one of construction and hope rather than punishment, is to use law in the creative and human way that we're talking about, that both ancient Israel and Christianity tried to do. But in this particular example, to give someone your cloak, think of a cloak as the only other thing you were wearing.
Oh, you're naked.
So when you give them your cloak, what are you?
Standing naked.
You are naked like a baby, okay? So if that's true, if they sue you for your coat, and you know, there in Exodus, there are codes about how if someone borrows your coat or takes your coat, you must give it back to them before sunset, okay? Because they know that that's an important garment. You don't want them to be cold, okay? There are these kind of a lot of laws and rules and instructions about cloaks and clothing sharing. But in this case, what does it do? What does it accomplish when someone sues you for your outer garment? And then Jesus says, if they do that, then give them your cloak as well. What does that accomplish? And this is also in court, okay? You're in court doing this. So they sue you in court for your coat, give them your cloak and stand there naked in court. That's basically it. So what is that accomplishing?
Makes them look pretty bad.
It turns the shame on them. Exactly. It doesn't break any rules. Look, if you go to court, you have a couple options. If you're taken to court and they sue you for your coat, you can accept it. Great, you've lost your coat. You can resist it and run, and that will lead to worse consequences. Or in a system like this, where you've been sort of sued for something like that, maybe there's an injustice there, you demonstrate it's a shame on them when you stand there naked because you don't have anything left. And again, within Exodus, there are all sorts of protections about how we hold each other, how we honor each other by making sure that everyone has some kind of clothing. Okay, so this is an understood thing. And Jesus is sort of, once again, inviting resistance, not non-resistance. Okay, you know what? It's non-resistance in that it's non-violent resistant. Yeah, but that's not the clearest term, is there? Non-resistance. No, it's clearly resistance, but it's a way of standing up within the law, within the codes, and yet claiming your dignity, standing with your feet planted on the ground, loud and proud, but the shame is on them.
I don't know.
Bev just said, I don't know about that. But within the context of the society, when the valuation, when it was valued to make sure that your neighbor had some kind of clothing, it is in an honor shame culture like that, it would have communicated something a little on top of, yes, maybe it to us, it does seem like, something's missing here, something's wrong. But no, it's a statement. It's a statement along the lines of the first, of holding dignity, of not letting someone just rule over you by claiming the things that you need that help keep you alive, that help keep you warm and safe. These are basics. You know, your cloak is it's the last layer of protection from the elements. And Jesus says, give that to them too. And then see what they do.
But it's odd that a cloak for us is the outermost.
Yeah, it's a terminology thing. Yeah, the coat is the outer.
Misinterpret that.
It
It's like,
easily.
okay, give him cloak, you know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because we still have our long underwear or whatever else we're wearing. Yes, no, it's a great point. Our modern understanding of the word cloak it's just different. It's just different. But a cloak is an undergarment, or the garment underneath your coat, and it would have often been the only other layer. I don't think they wore undies back there.
It says tunic, right?
Okay, yeah, tunic would be probably a better word that people would understand. Yeah, yeah. Any other questions or comments about that one? All right, let's go to the extra mile one. What's that one all about? Go the extra mile. Work harder. What's that mean? Ken, you can do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there are rules that are, things that a soldier could penalize, to make you carry the backpack or whatever.
Yep.
And by going beyond that, you get them in trouble.
I don't know about necessarily getting in trouble, but you could. But here's the thing. Yes, there were laws within Rome of conscription. So soldiers could ask any citizen, well, anyone below them, to carry their pack for 1 mile. For 1 mile.
Oh.
Jesus tells us to go the extra mile. I don't know. I think I'm not sure about the whole that it puts shame on the soldier to do that. It might be some of that, but what else can you think of that it could do if Jesus says, go the extra mile? You've been conscripted to go 1 mile, but Jesus says, go the extra mile. What's the difference? What does that accomplish? Barbara, tell me.
It means it's your choice to go the other mile.
Amen. Amen. You got told you had to take it the first mile, but now you're saying, I'm not going to be your pack animal. I'm a human freaking being, and I'm going to choose to take this another mile. Now, that could shame him a little bit, but I think it's more about, once again, just like the first two examples, claiming human dignity and agency in a world that tried to keep putting you in your place.
Mhm.
Powerful stuff. Yeah, very powerful.
It's expressing free will.
Think what a difference it makes when you have to do something versus when you voluntarily.
When you
do
choose
something.
to. Yes.
Much better it makes you feel.
Yes, Horty said it. It's an expression of our free will. And where free will is present, we are fully human. It's only those who are imprisoned or enslaved that don't have free will. That's why the Sabbath is so important. Remember, only people who are free can take a day of rest.
Mm-hmm.
Can choose to take a day of rest. But this is an act of volition. To go the extra mile is an act of choice, saying, you don't get to tell me, I'm going to do it for you, which may have shamed them, but I think it was more about the person themselves. In a world that kept trying to marginalize and keep certain, elements of society down, Jesus was all about stand up. Here's how we do it. Here's how you do it without poking the bear, but still holding your dignity and your power and claiming that. Marcia.
I could see the shame in that it's like, I'm a little stronger than you. So you feel
Yes,
big deal.
that I can see that too. Yeah, that it could shame the soldier. And it's like, okay, now you're making a spectacle out of us. And it's just, but I mean, who knows? You know, who knows? It's hard to know how these things played out. But you think of the story of Simon of Cyrene, the one that was conscripted to carry the cross of Jesus. That was the whole conscription law playing out. He had to carry it. Now, I forget if the story talks about how he carried it extra, but I don't know that it does. But that was part of it. And he carried that crossbeam. Okay. This is what was sort of just part of the society, part of what the expectation was. But Jesus is saying, no, don't let them keep you down. You choose. You choose to go the extra mile. Okay. I want to make sure I didn't miss anyone online that might have any kind of comments. So what are some of then, as we kind of get close to wrapping it up, it's just after 10, what are some of the takeaways then that you have with the way, you know, just from Jesus reimagining of the law, or just a new appreciation you have of Israel's law? What are some of the things that you feel like you'll take away with you today? Bev, I see your
The
smile.
way you presented Jesus, I am not even wondering anymore why the Romans had to get rid of him.
Yes, such a good point. You know, we talked about this before, but we all know the Warner Sallman picture of Jesus that looks like a baby, blue-eyed, soft and, you know, loving, like a little lamb kind of picture. And yet these stories in the Bible remind us what a revolutionary he was. And it helps us understand why Rome felt the need to get rid of him, because he was an agitator.
Yeah.
He did it in very creative ways, somewhat subtle ways. Maybe we don't think of some of them as subtle, but he was a master teacher, a master provoker, a master of lifting the human spirit. And that was dangerous to Rome. And so it helps connect the dots, because as a kid, I remember always asking the question that a lot of us ask as our adult age now. And that is, why did they have to kill Jesus? He was so loving. He was so caring of all people. What the heck? It doesn't make any sense. It does start to make sense when you start to see these passages play out. And the Sermon on the Mount is one of the main ones. Sandy.
Could we call this assertiveness?
Absolutely, it's assertiveness. Yes, it's assertiveness in a nonviolent resistance kind of way. It's assertiveness that's not responding with violence. You know, it's not, oh, you get slapped on the cheek, punch him back. You know, that's only going to escalate. Jesus is talking about how do we eradicate, how do we break the systems of violence? And this is a way of being assertive and standing up without being violent or creating more harm. Powerful. And these principles have guided nonviolent movements since then. That's what the famous movements we know are rooted in this. I saw another hand here. Yes, Bill, and then Horty, and then Dick.
Oh, now do it. Okay.
I think it's also showing how to maintain one's personal dignity and also equality in this situation.
Yes. Yeah, it's a commentary on the honor-shame system itself and the stratification of society. And Jesus was trying to level a lot of that and not make it about what we value, but what God values is the human dignity of all people. Yeah. Horty?
Just one little tiny takeaway was I appreciate what you said about the Pharisees. We were always seeing them as like really rotten, awful, terrible people. And for you to talk about their perspective of the loss of being exiled from Babylon and not wanting to repeat that, just really gave me a different perspective. And I thank you for that.
Well, thank you for saying that. You know, when we can start to appreciate the Gospels as story, then the role that the Pharisees play becomes clearer. And it's good to have clear bad guys and clear good guys when you're telling a story, because it communicates something of a message that's just clearer. Now, listen, sometimes it is gray. The disciples themselves are very gray because they're treated, the way they're presented in most of the Gospels, if not all of them, is kind of buffoons. But they serve a purpose. In the context of telling a good story, the disciples are us. So when they don't understand, it just gives Jesus in the stories a chance to re-explain it, okay? To say it again, so that when the Bible and when the Gospels are being presented as they were orally, the audience could hear it again too. You see how that functions? When you hear it as story and not necessarily as history, it opens up how it can land and how it functions. You know, too many of us have learned or have thought, if you ever saw The Merchant of Venice and you see, Shylock, the Jew, who's always out for his pound of flesh, we have this attitude that has been so mistaken that Jews were these legalistic, barbaric kind of had that kind of approach to meting out justice. And what seems clear, the more we get into this, is it wasn't like that at all. And what's ironic is we often, as Christians in this case, we think of ourselves as being higher because we look at some of these scriptures spiritually rather than literally. And yet, in terms of looking at Jewish law, we turn around and assign a literalistic view on Judaism that may have never been there. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like we're saying, oh, well, you read all these things literally. And the truth is, you look at the rabbinic texts, you look at all the texts written for centuries afterwards, and you see all they do is argue and try to play with it and try to interpret it. And it's not this one sort of, monolithic approach, literal at all. It's much more figurative. They saw them as legal principles, and that allows you to sort of like, all right, so then what does it mean? That's what Judaism's always been about. And yet we have this ingrained approach to what their law means to them. And I feel we're just simply mistaken. So we can see how our law or Jesus rephrasing the Torah is not just about being more merciful and nice, but it's about standing up and being resisting in that nonviolent way. And we can also see how Israel's law is not necessarily the legal codes that we understand modern day. They're not necessarily lived out on a day-to-day basis. They're principles. They help guide society. That was how they're intended. So again, it's just a way of opening. I'm not trying to tell you, okay, so now when you read this passage, you have to look at it this way. No, it just opens it up, doesn't it? It allows more freedom, just room to breathe in these texts. And that is always a good thing. I think that always helps us in terms of our approach to these ancient stories. Any other closing kind of comments or questions? Marilyn?
I think one of the reasons that these kinds of ways of seeing ourselves and Jewish people or other groups as well, Buddhists, Hindus, is the separation of the groups into groups.
Yeah.
That I became very dear friends with this woman. And she wasn't strongly devout, but I go to the high holy days with her, and I'd be aware of the kind of conversations that people were having and the sort of issues that were brought up at that time. And it just changed me completely.
Yep.
And so I now describe myself as a Jewish Christian, because I just saw and learned some things, some ways that she approached me that I just really value.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I think the more we can have contact with people who are from different groups, the more we can learn to appreciate and understand and learn from
Yes.
who they are.
And I hope that a course like this can open up the idea that, wow, we've sectionalized this, we've compartmentalized this, we've made value judgments about each other for too long. Maybe it does open the door for us to really reach out and kind of let's get connected better, to whether it's in friendship or just in any of the ways. I really want us to have a Seder this year. Ken brought that up. We've been kind of talking about, it'd be really great to do that again, to follow up this. So I'm working on that. Somewhat it depends on, a couple factors here, but that's what I want to do. Again, it kind of just gets us connected to the reality that we are immersed in each other's stories. Okay, so let's work more towards understanding that than all the ways that we find these areas of distinction and division. All right. Well, thank you all again. Next week, we'll be reading John chapter 6, verses 53 to 56 and Exodus 12, 23 to 22 to 23. The topic will be drink my blood, sacrifice and atonement. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're not meeting next week.
No, I was going to say,
Yeah,
not next week.
time. Next time.
Not-
I'm going to be away next week, so do not come next week.
Oh.
Okay, please, but do come the week
I
after.
didn't know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. God bless you all.
Dan, there's something I would like, to ask you.
Okay,
So
everyone.
I will text you.
I'll have to figure out
Oh, okay.
from there.
That sounds good. Thank you. All right. Thank you all.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.